Finally, we begin our look at topic 1.6, the interactions between Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans in the New World. Of course, as the Spanish encountered various native cultures, both in the Americas and in Africa, shared ideas as well as conflict and misunderstandings were inevitable. Missionaries converted Native Americans in the New World to Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism. Having survived wars with the Moors and driving them out of Spain just before Christopher Columbus's voyage westward, Spain wanted to ensure that as many subjects as possible became members of the Church. It is important to remember how important Christianity was to European culture at this time. Today, there was no official separation of church and state, and politics and religion were very much intertwined. So when explorers such as Columbus or Juan Ponce de Leon or John Cabot claimed land in the name of the king, they were also claiming that land for God, with the intention of bringing their national religion to that region. The Spanish were particularly zealous in their missionary activities, setting up mission churches throughout the Americas, where priests and other church leaders attempted to evangelize Native American groups. Some Spanish missionaries were kind and gracious towards Native Americans, but others were ruthless to the extent that conversion took place at the point of a sword. You converted, or you died. The Spanish would create the first European settlement in what is now the United States, at St. Augustine, in what is now Florida, founding a mission church there at the same time. They also founded Santa Fe, New Mexico, in 1610, and much later, in the early 1700s, began the mission system in present-day California. But since they made little effort to populate these northern territories, we're not really going to spend a tremendous amount of time on them, at least not until the United States shows a desire to acquire the land that belongs to Spain, acquiring Florida, New Mexico, and later California. Of course, some of that land being acquired after the territory was independent of Spain and was the country of Mexico. Some of the sources of conflict between the Europeans and the Native Americans stemmed from their cultural differences. Some native cultures were matriarchal in nature, meaning female-dominated, which is significantly different from the patriarchal nature of European society, meaning male-dominated. Some native societies treated women much more equally, but really you didn't see the kind of male domination within native cultures like you did in European society. The division of labor along gender lines was also quite different amongst the native peoples than it was in Europe. In many native culture, men were responsible for hunting, warfare, and ceremony, while women were responsible for childcare and the preparation of food and clothing. And this would include farming, as often being a woman's occupation, since that was part of the growth and preparation of food. In European societies, women served largely as managers of their households. They were expected to focus on practical domestic pursuits and activities that encouraged the betterment of their families, and in particular, the betterment of their husbands. Agricultural work was not seen as a domestic pursuit, so that is part of that male-dominated society. So when Native Americans saw European men farming, they viewed that as women's work or inferior to themselves. But to Europeans, land was a commodity, another major difference between them, which meant as a commodity, land could be bought and sold and assigned to a new owner, assigned to an individual, not just a collective group, which is more how Native Americans viewed land ownership. They certainly didn't view it as something that you could own individually. It was like the air. You certainly could not own air. As a result, Native groups would sell land, but in their minds, they'd only sold the right to use the land. They could, of course, continue to use it as well because it couldn't be owned. And that often brought conflict because Europeans felt that ownership meant that you had an exclusive right to it. Another major difference is that most Native peoples worshipped an all-powerful or all-knowing creator or master spirit, a being that assumed a variety of forms and often both genders. But at the same time, they also venerated numerous other lesser supernatural entities, including in some an evil god who dealt out disaster or suffering or death. And some of these lesser spirits sometimes took the form of animals or even plants. But Christianity, which of course is what the Spaniards adhered to, by definition was a very exclusive religion, and converts required the rejection of all other gods, which often led to conflict between priests and native peoples. Resistance to Spanish occupation of native lands and the subjugation of the people would inevitably lead to conflict between the two groups. Natives could resist Spanish occupiers by running away from the encomienda or the repartimiento. They could be pursued, of course, but native knowledge of the land and the lack of the conquistadors' knowledge of the area would give the natives a better chance of getting away. Of course, the disadvantage was that it's also the perfect opportunity for disease to spread amongst the native population, who'd perhaps never even set eyes on Europeans. Because as those who had contact with Europeans moved away, they brought those microbes with them to people who, again, had never experienced it. Native peoples could also show resistance by slowing the pace of work or sabotaging tools and equipment, though this was less common amongst this group, much less common than it would become amongst African slaves later on. Outright revolt was also another form of resistance to European occupation, and as a case study, we'll look briefly at the Pueblo Revolt, which happened in 1680. Now, by 1610, Spanish conquistadors had established their rule in present-day New Mexico, and through the mission system had forced the conversion of many of the Pueblo people to Roman Catholicism. But a series of droughts and attacks by other native groups caused the Pueblo people to come to the conclusion that the cause of all of their trouble were the Spanish invaders and their God. So they revolted against the Spanish occupation, burning churches and killing around 400 Spaniards and forcing more than 2,000 to flee back into modern-day Mexico. This was a victory for the Pueblo people, and it is also sometimes called Pope's Rebellion. However, it's a relatively short-lived victory, because about 12 years after this initial success, the Spanish returned and reconquered the land. Though these actions did bring up a debate in Spain itself, mostly about the brutal treatment that the conquistadors had meted out against the native peoples. Some argued that the native peoples were inferior, so therefore it was acceptable. But others defended the Native Americans, including a man by the name of Bartolome de las Casas, who worried that not only were these potential souls to be lost, but that the survivors would refuse to accept Christ unless the Spanish changed their ways towards the native peoples. He suggested instead that Africans should replace natives in the forced labor system because of the justifications that we've already looked at in this, religious justification of Africans being the descendants of Canaan, and it's being tied to perpetual slavery that had already been named within the Bible itself.